Let's get started. Story number 1.
I'd been on the road for hours when it happened. The endless stretch of asphalt snaking through the heart of nowhere had become both hypnotic and suffocating. My car's headlights barely pierced the thick, oppressive fog that enveloped the road. The radio had long since gone silent, the static of an empty channel offering no comfort. I had no service, and my phone was nearly dead. There were no other cars in sight, just trees and the occasional sign that barely flickered in the beam of my headlights, announcing towns that had long since passed by. I had been heading to a small, secluded cabin that I'd rented for the weekend, a little getaway I had hoped would bring some peace of mind. The type of place where you could escape the noise of everyday life, even if just for a short while. I knew the road was remote, but it was worse than I had imagined. The winding path seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of civilization anywhere. I had just passed a sign that read, "Next gas 50 miles," when I noticed something odd. There, at the side of the road, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another strange mirage, a trick of the fog, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man standing perfectly still, his back to me. He was dressed in a worn, dark jacket with a hood pulled up, obscuring his face. I didn't know if he was hitchhiking, stranded, or simply walking, but my instincts told me to keep driving. I passed him without slowing down, but something felt wrong. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the man had not moved. He was still standing there in the same spot, staring into the fog. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. The silence of the night felt suffocating. My mind raced, wondering if I had done the right thing. What if he needed help? What if something was wrong? I couldn't just ignore him, could I? Reluctantly, I turned the wheel and circled back. I pulled over a little ahead of him, and before I could second-guess myself, I rolled down the window. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out, my voice steady despite the nervous tightness in my chest. There was no response. I called out again, a little louder this time. "Do you need help?" Still no answer. The man didn't even flinch. He remained motionless, facing the trees. I couldn't make out his face beneath the hood. A knot tightened in my stomach. Something was off about this whole situation. I considered driving off again, but I didn't want to feel guilty. I called out one last time. "Can I help you? Do you need a ride?" And then something happened. The man, still without turning around, slowly raised his arm. His hand hovered for a moment before he pointed, directly at me. The finger seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something cold about the gesture, as if the air around me had grown heavier. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I shifted into reverse, slowly pulling back. As I did, my headlights illuminated the space around him. That's when I saw it. A second figure. A woman. She was standing a little further off the road, hidden by the thick fog, her face pale and expressionless. She, too, was dressed in dark clothes, her body slightly hunched as though she was waiting for something. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel as my heart hammered in my chest. I glanced back at the man, whose finger was still pointed at me. The woman remained still, her eyes never leaving me, though her face was barely visible in the fog. A sudden, overpowering sense of dread washed over me. I wasn't alone. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. My tires screeched as I sped away, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw the man still standing in the same spot, but the woman was gone. The fog was thick, and I couldn't make out anything behind me. I didn't dare look back until I was sure I had put distance between myself and whatever I had just encountered. As the minutes passed, I tried to calm myself. I had to remind myself it was probably just some weird locals, maybe a couple of people playing a prank in the middle of nowhere. But the unease never left me. Every creak and groan of the car sounded like someone was in the back seat, breathing down my neck. I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them following me. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was a car coming up from behind. But as I squinted into the thick fog, I realized the lights were too dim, too flickering to be from a vehicle. They were like lanterns, faint but distinct, floating along the side of the road. And they were moving. They were moving toward me. My pulse quickened. I pressed the gas pedal harder, not knowing what else to do. The lights kept pace with me, drifting just out of reach. I thought I was imagining it, but the more I focused, the clearer they became. There were more than one, at least 3 or 4, bobbing in the fog like will-o'-the-wisps, their orange glow casting eerie shadows along the trees. I didn't know what to think. Were they people? Some sort of strange phenomenon? Either way, I couldn't outrun them. The road was too narrow and the fog had swallowed up everything beyond my headlights. The lights drew closer. They hovered around my car, too close now, and I could see the figures, 3 or 4 of them with distorted faces that I couldn't quite make out. The details were blurry, like they were being viewed through a veil. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and as they moved, they seemed to sway in and out of existence, flickering like a dying candle. The air turned ice cold. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted. My hands trembled on the wheel as I tried to keep my car steady. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The lights blinked out, leaving only the oppressive darkness and fog behind. My car's headlights shone on an empty stretch of road. No figures, no lights, just the void. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, a small place with a few scattered houses and a couple of gas stations. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, I sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were still shaking. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee to steady my nerves. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, noticed my anxious demeanor. She asked if everything was okay. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There was something out there. On the road. I saw figures." The waitress frowned. "You were on the old highway, weren't you?" I nodded, still unable to explain what I had seen. She sighed. "Yeah. People talk about things like that happening out there. Strange lights. Figures. Some say the road's haunted by those who got lost out there long ago. Folks say it's not safe after dark." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She didn't need to explain further. I never took that road again. Every time I pass through that area, I make sure to take the main highway, even if it adds hours to my journey. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and the fog rolls in, I'll catch myself glancing nervously into the rearview mirror. And every time, I swear I see something, a shadow, a flicker of light, a figure standing just outside the reach of the headlights. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
I'd never believed in ghosts, but the events that happened to me in the middle of nowhere changed that forever. I had planned the trip for months, hoping for some peace and quiet to recharge. A friend recommended a cabin out in the woods, far from civilization. The nearest town was at least a 2-hour drive away, with nothing but trees and winding roads in between. It sounded perfect, just the kind of isolation I needed. The cabin, she told me, was rustic and simple, but it had a charm that made it worthwhile. No distractions, just the sound of nature. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun dipping low as I pulled my car up to the small wooden cabin. The setting was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and a wide, open field. There was a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, and the small, worn porch looked inviting. I opened the door and stepped inside. It smelled of cedar wood and something faintly musty, old but comforting. The perfect place to unwind. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and lighting a fire in the small stove. As the night began to fall, I poured myself a drink, sat back in the worn leather armchair by the fire, and listened to the crackling flames. The world outside felt far away, and I felt the tension from my city life slowly melt away. There was no phone signal, no internet, nothing but the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. I had finally found the peace I'd been craving. By the time the clock read 10 p.m., I was exhausted. I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, thinking I would fall asleep easily. The sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl drifted in from the window. It was the perfect lullaby. But then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost like a tap on the door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The cabin was isolated. I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived, and the idea of someone being out there seemed impossible. I stayed still, hoping it was just the wind or an animal. But then it came again, louder this time, a deliberate knock. I got out of bed slowly and made my way to the door, hesitant, heart pounding. I peeked through the small peephole, but I saw nothing. The night outside was dark and still. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside onto the porch. The cool air hit me immediately, and I shivered, scanning the yard. There was no sign of movement, no footprints in the dirt, nothing. I chalked it up to my nerves, a trick of the mind. Maybe a branch had brushed against the door in the wind. I closed the door, locked it, and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to sleep again, but the air felt thick, the silence unsettling. Every small sound seemed amplified. The wind outside felt different, almost like it was carrying whispers. I told myself I was imagining things, but then I heard the tapping again. This time it wasn't on the door. It was coming from the window. I froze. I walked slowly toward the window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I pulled the curtain back further, shining my flashlight outside, fidele, but I saw nothing but the darkness and the trees stretching into the distance. My pulse quickened. I backed away from the window, the sense of unease creeping over me. I locked the window, checked the other windows in the cabin, and went to the door again, double-checking the locks. But something still didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. The cabin was old, and old houses made noises, but the air seemed heavier now, suffocating almost. Hours passed, and I eventually managed to fall asleep, though it was restless. My dreams were strange. Fragmented images of shadows moving just outside the window and soft whispers that I couldn't make out. When I woke up, it was still dark outside. The silence felt unnervingly thick. The fire had gone out, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I had just been imagining things. I spent the day outside, walking through the woods, taking in the fresh air and trying to clear my mind. The sun was bright, and the birds were chirping. Everything seemed normal again. But as the evening drew near, that old sense of unease returned. I lit the stove and started preparing some dinner, but my mind kept drifting back to the previous night. I kept hearing the faint sound of footsteps on the porch, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't want to seem irrational, but something was telling me that I wasn't alone out here. As the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I decided to take a walk around the property. I needed to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The trees seemed to loom over me, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The trail behind the cabin led into the woods where I hadn't ventured the previous day. As I walked deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound of my boots crunching on the fallen leaves was the only thing breaking the silence. That's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, just off the trail. I stopped in my tracks. The figure was tall, almost impossibly tall, and its features were obscured by the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I blinked, I could make out the outline of a person, standing still, watching me. I called out, my voice shaky, asking if someone was there. But the figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, as though it was waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't look back, but I felt like something was following me. The footsteps behind me were faint, but unmistakable. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I could hear my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I went to the window and looked out into the woods. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it the feeling that something was watching me from just outside. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn tight, but it didn't matter. The presence I felt out there was real. I could feel it. By morning, I had had enough. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. I packed up my things, left the key on the kitchen counter, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I made my way down the winding dirt road, eager to leave the woods behind. I never went back, and I never will. The middle of nowhere wasn't as empty as I thought. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I didn't realize how isolated I was until it was too late. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching ahead of me like a never-ending ribbon through the vast, empty landscape. There was nothing but farmland and sparse woods on either side, the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car or person. I had gotten a late start, deciding to take the scenic route to my cabin out in the middle of nowhere. The plan was simple: enjoy a quiet weekend away from the city. I figured I could use the time to clear my head, but the further I drove, the more I began to feel a strange sense of unease. I thought I was just tired, maybe a little jumpy from being alone for so long, but something about this road felt different. The sun had set hours ago, and now the only light came from my headlights, which barely cut through the thickening fog. My phone had lost signal long ago, and the only sounds were the hum of my car and the occasional creak of the tires on the uneven road. I wasn't even sure if I was still on the main route. The road had become so narrow and winding that I couldn't be sure anymore. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere with no sign of civilization in sight. That's when I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog or a shadow cast by the trees. But as I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of a person standing off the side of the road. It wasn't like the usual hitchhiker you'd expect on a lonely stretch of highway. This person wasn't moving at all. In fact, they looked like they were just standing there, staring into the woods, completely still. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. It was strange. No one would be out here at this hour, not this far from anywhere. I could have driven past, but something compelled me to stop. Maybe it was the possibility of them needing help, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just loneliness after hours of driving through endless emptiness. I rolled down my window. "Hey," I called out, trying to make my voice sound calm. "Are you okay?" There was no response. I waited a few seconds before calling again, louder this time. "Are you all right?" Still, nothing. The figure just stood there, motionless. I couldn't make out any details. The fog was thick, and their features were obscured by the darkness. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. But I felt this strange chill run through me, a sensation that told me something wasn't right. I debated driving on, but I didn't want to leave them out there if they needed help. I shifted the car into park and opened the door, cautiously stepping out into the cold night air. My feet sank into the gravel as I slowly approached the figure. The closer I got, the more my heart began to race. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut. The figure hadn't moved an inch. As I stepped closer, I hesitated, staring at them. I wanted to reach out, to shake them, to make sure they were real. But then the strangest thing happened. The figure slowly turned its head, just slightly, enough for me to see the face. I froze. The face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. The skin around the eyes was stretched tight, and the mouth was drawn into a thin, unnatural line. There was something wrong with the way the face was contorted. The most unsettling part was how it seemed to flicker in and out of focus. 1 second, it was clear, and the next, it was blurry, like I was seeing something that wasn't quite there. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't say anything. It just stared. I couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, to drive away as fast as I could. I turned and sprinted back, not looking behind me, my breath coming in quick gasps. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, not bothering to check if the figure was still there. I sped down the road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Was it a person? A trick of the light? A hallucination from exhaustion? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the closer I got to my cabin, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally arrived, the cabin was dark, sitting quietly at the edge of the woods. I parked my car outside and just sat there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. But as I looked out at the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned off the car and made my way inside. The house was small, just one room with a fireplace, a few old chairs, and a bed covered in thick blankets. I locked the door behind me, the sound of the bolts sliding into place making my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that nothing was out there. But every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the trees made me jump. I sat by the fire, trying to relax, but the unsettling memory of the figure outside lingered. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, though it wasn't peaceful. I kept dreaming of the figure, that pale face staring at me, following me in the darkness. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, heart racing. Each time, I would check the windows, make sure everything was locked, and eventually force myself back to sleep. In the morning, I tried to convince myself that the night had just been a bad dream. But as I opened the door to step outside, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the doorstep, was a small pile of gravel, exactly where I had parked my car. And in the middle of it, just barely visible, were footprints. The tracks were fresh, like someone had been standing right there in the night. But what sent a chill down my spine was the pattern of the footprints. They were smaller than mine, and they didn't seem to lead anywhere. They were just there, as if someone had appeared out of nowhere and stood for a moment before disappearing again. I didn't stay another night. The drive back through that same stretch of road was a blur. I couldn't get out of there fast enough, my mind racing with unanswered questions. What had I seen? Who, or what, was that figure? And why did it feel like I had just narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to see? I don't know if I'll ever return to that cabin. The road in the middle of nowhere holds too many memories of that night, memories I can't shake. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I'd found a remote cabin online, tucked away in a valley far from any town or city. The kind of place where you could escape everything. Work, technology, the noise of life. Just me, the forest, and the silence. I'd never been to such a secluded spot before, but something about it felt like it was exactly what I needed. I set out late on a Friday afternoon, the sun dipping behind the mountains as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The roads grew narrower, twisting around trees and sharp corners. It didn't help that my GPS kept cutting out, leaving me to rely on the directions given to me by the cabin's owner. I remember thinking how odd it was that there were no other cars on the road, but the thought was fleeting. I arrived around dusk, the cabin perched at the edge of a large, dense forest. It looked like a scene from a movie, wooden, weathered, with a small porch and a chimney that let out a thin stream of smoke. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled like pine. A perfect place to unwind, I thought. Inside, the cabin was just as quaint as I had imagined. There was an old-fashioned stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a large window that framed the forest outside. I felt a strange sense of calm as I unpacked, setting up my things and lighting a fire. The sun set quickly, leaving behind a dark, inky sky. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. As night fell, I sat down to dinner, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Afterward, I curled up on the couch with a book, the warmth of the cabin comforting me as the wind howled outside. Then there was a knock. It was soft at first, almost like it was part of the wind. But when it came again, 3 short, distinct knocks, I froze. I looked around the room, trying to place where the sound had come from. The windows were shut tight, and I could see the front door from where I sat. No one could have approached without me noticing. I stood up and moved cautiously toward the door. I didn't know why, but a strange unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It was just a knock, I told myself. Maybe someone had come by to check on the cabin. I opened the door. No one was there. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the dark yard and the towering trees that surrounded the cabin. There was no sign of anyone, no car, no movement, nothing. I stood there for a moment, shaking off the unease before closing the door and locking it. I thought I'd imagined it, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But later, when I tried to sleep, the knocking came again. Only this time, it was louder, more urgent. My heart raced in my chest as I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. I got up and checked the door again. Nothing, just the stillness of the night. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I pulled the curtains tight, bolted the door, and tried to sleep. Hours passed, and I dozed fitfully. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside, slow, deliberate footsteps, soft on the dirt. My first instinct was to dismiss it as an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. But the sound was too purposeful, too rhythmic. It stopped just outside the window. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were followed by a faint whisper, a voice, but not one I could understand. The hairs on my arms stood up. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I slowly pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing. Just the dark expanse of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but I knew, without a doubt, that something had been there. I spent the rest of the night on edge, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone scratching at the door. It was too much. I could no longer deny it. I wasn't alone in the cabin. By morning, the strange occurrences had stopped, and I convinced myself it had all been in my head. I decided to spend the day hiking through the woods, hoping to clear my mind and regain some perspective. The day was beautiful, bright, sunny, and peaceful. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I tried to forget about the previous night, focusing on the crunch of leaves beneath my boots as I walked deeper into the trees. But something was off. I wandered farther into the woods than I intended, and after a while, I realized I'd lost track of the trail. My phone had no signal, and the sun was beginning to dip low. I hurriedly turned back, trying to retrace my steps. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, was a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and standing perfectly still. The figure had no distinguishable features, just a dark shape against the forest backdrop. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence, an oppressive energy that seemed to swallow the air around it. I didn't know what to do. I stood frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It felt like time had stopped. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the woods. No movement. No sound. Just gone. I ran back to the cabin, my heart racing. My legs were shaking, and I was out of breath by the time I got inside. I locked all the doors and windows, pulling the curtains tight. I sat in the dark, listening to the wind outside, the silence in the cabin almost suffocating. That night, I heard the knocks again. This time, though, they were louder, more forceful. There were no footsteps, no whispers, just the persistent, deafening sound of someone or something pounding on the door. I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my keys, threw on my shoes, and ran outside. The forest was dark and still, but I didn't care. I started the car and sped down the narrow dirt road, not looking back. It wasn't until I reached the main highway, several miles away, that I dared to stop and take a breath. My hands were trembling, my mind reeling. What had happened at that cabin? Who or what had been there? I never went back. I never even wanted to think about it again. The middle of nowhere, I realized, isn't always as empty as it seems. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I've always been the type to laugh off ghost stories. That was until the night I found myself deep in the middle of nowhere, driving a stretch of road so remote I questioned whether I was still in the world I knew. I was headed to a small cabin I'd rented for the weekend, desperate for solitude. No service, no distractions, just me, the woods, and the open sky. It seemed like a perfect escape from the demands of city life. The trip had started off fine. I'd driven through some picturesque little towns, stopped for coffee in the kind of places that felt stuck in time. But the closer I got to the cabin, the emptier the road seemed. The last gas station was over an hour ago, and the only signs of life were the occasional deer darting across the road. The sky was dark, and I could feel the isolation creeping in. The further I went, the more I realized that the map I had didn't really seem to landscape. I wasn't exactly lost, but I wasn't entirely sure where I was either. The cabin was supposed to be just a few miles ahead, but something felt wrong. There was an uneasy feeling that seemed to settle over me the longer I drove. The road began to narrow, winding through dense trees, and the fog rolled in, thick as a blanket, swallowing up the last slivers of daylight. I tried calling the cabin's owner to confirm my directions, but the signal cut out, as it had several times before. No surprise, really. I had anticipated this. The road was too remote for a good connection. I glanced down at my phone, watching the battery drop to 15%, and tried not to panic. And then I saw it, a figure in the road, standing still in the fog. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the mist, a tree or rock shaped like a person, But as I got closer, I could make out the faint outline of a person just standing there, motionless. My heart rate picked up. It was late, and I hadn't passed another soul for miles. No one should be out here, especially not this time of night. I debated just driving past, but something made me stop. I rolled down my window, trying to calm my nerves. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" There was no response. I called again, louder this time. The figure didn't move. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell that they were staring right at me. I couldn't make out much of their clothes either, just dark shapes against the fog. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "Are you lost?" I asked, trying to sound calm despite the growing sense of unease in my gut. There was still no answer, but then slowly the figure raised a hand. I froze. It didn't wave or gesture in any way, but held the hand out, palm up, like they were waiting for something. My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what to do. I'd been raised to help people in need, but something about this didn't feel right. I could feel a coldness creeping into the air around me, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to roll up the window and drive away, but my body wouldn't obey. I just sat there, staring at the figure, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. Not toward me, but away. They turned slowly, their back now to me, and started walking toward the trees that lined the road. But it wasn't a normal walk. It was slow, stiff, and deliberate. I couldn't take my eyes off of them as they disappeared into the fog, step by step. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the spot where they'd vanished. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but I didn't feel like I could move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't add up. What kind of person would be out here at this time of night, so far from any town? And why didn't they speak to me? Why had they raised their hand like that? It all felt wrong. I finally snapped out of it, slamming the car into drive and speeding away. I don't even know how I managed to make it to the cabin. The rest of the drive was a blur. When I arrived, I didn't bother unpacking right away. I locked all the doors and drew the blinds, telling myself I just needed a few minutes to settle in. But something still felt off. I kept hearing sounds outside the cabin, like footsteps in the distance or something scraping against the ground. Every time I looked outside, there was nothing there. I decided to try to sleep, to force myself to forget about what I'd seen. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in my mind, standing in the road, waiting. It was just a dream, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks. But then, around 3 a.m., I heard a knock at the door. It was faint at first, almost like it could have been the wind. But then there was another knock, louder this time. 3 short, sharp raps, one after the other. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't move. I was too scared to even breathe. It had to be a prank. There was no way anyone would be out here, knocking on my door in the dead of night. But even as I told myself that, my mind wouldn't let go of the idea that it was the same figure I'd seen on the road, standing there, waiting. I waited for the knock to come again, but it didn't. I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence, my pulse racing in my ears. I wanted to get up, to check the door, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I crept to the door, trying to peer through the small crack where the blinds didn't meet. Nothing. No one. Just the fog, still thick and heavy outside. I don't know if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the figure had felt real. The knock had felt real. And the feeling that I wasn't alone, like someone or something was watching me, hadn't gone away. It followed me back home, too. To this day, I haven't been able to explain what happened. I can't shake the feeling that I saw something that night, something that was never meant to be seen, and I never went back to that cabin again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been the adventurous type, craving solitude and escape from the everyday grind. That's why when I found a listing for a cabin deep in the woods, I knew it was exactly what I needed. The cabin was located hours away from the nearest town, with no other houses for miles around. It seemed like the perfect place for a weekend of quiet reflection. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the winding country roads giving way to dirt paths. The further I went, the more isolated it became. Eventually, the road became narrow, surrounded by thick trees on both sides, making it impossible to see anything but the occasional gap where the sun pierced through the branches. As I arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the small structure. It was rustic, nothing fancy, but charming in its simplicity. I could already feel the peace I was seeking settling in as I unloaded my things and set about making myself at home. The cabin was cozy and the fire crackled warmly in the fireplace. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I unpacked a few books and settled into an armchair, feeling content in the silence. Night came quickly. I made a small dinner and sat by the fire, sipping a glass of wine and reading. It was the perfect way to wind down until a sharp sound broke the stillness. A knock. It came from the door, 3 quick raps. I froze, staring at the door. The wind could have caused it, I thought. Perhaps a branch brushing against the wood. But it wasn't just the knock that made me uneasy. It was the quiet that followed. There was no wind now, no sound from the forest. Just silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally standing up and walking cautiously to the door. I opened it. No one was there. I stepped outside onto the porch, looking around. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the only sound was the distant rustling of the trees. The air was cold, biting, and still. I glanced around the yard. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a wild animal had brushed against the door. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But as I settled back into my chair, the knock came again. 3 quick raps. This time, my heart began to race. I stood up and moved toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, a loud bang came from the back of the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. I froze again, my breath caught in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the continued sound of footsteps. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and walked toward the back of the cabin, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I swung the flashlight beam across the porch. Nothing. I checked behind the cabin. Still nothing. I walked back to the front of the house, my hands shaking as I locked the door again. The sounds stopped, and the world outside seemed to settle back into its quiet rhythm, but the fear remained lodged in my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or something. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried to sleep that night, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, what had been out there. Around 3 a.m., I heard the knocking again. 3 quick raps, followed by a pause, then another 3. It was too consistent to be the wind, and it wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, terrified, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The porch was empty, the woods were silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I turned in circles, shining the light into the darkness, but there was nothing. I felt the cold press in, colder than it should have been, and an eerie sensation washed over me, like the entire world had gone still and was holding its breath. I had to leave. I had no choice. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I was prepared to face. I ran back inside, locked the door for the last time, and packed my things in a frenzy. I was out of there. The drive back down the narrow, winding road was a blur. I didn't look back. The further I got from that cabin, the more the tension in my body began to ease, but I couldn't shake the images of what had happened. The knocking, the footsteps, the sense that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I stopped at a gas station to fuel up that I had a chance to breathe again. I had made it, or so I thought. I was standing at the pump when I noticed an older man watching me from the porch of the gas station. He had a weathered face, deep lines around his eyes, and a gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. He smiled faintly and waved, then stood up and started walking toward me. "I heard about that cabin," he said in a gravelly voice. "Happens to a lot of folks who go out there." I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? You're not the first," he said, his eyes flicking to the woods in the distance, just beyond the trees that surrounded the station. "There's something out there. Something not right." You'll never feel alone when you're in that cabin. I wouldn't stay there if I were you." I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat. It was as if the old man knew exactly what had happened, as if he'd been watching me the whole time. But how? "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered, turning away and walking back to the porch. I stayed in the area for a few more hours before deciding I had to go home. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that cabin. There was no rational explanation for the things I'd heard and seen. But I knew, deep down, that whatever it was wasn't something I could outrun. It wasn't something that could be explained away by simple logic or reason. I never went back to the woods, never returned to that cabin. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear the soft, steady knock at the door, echoing in the dark. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always loved driving through the countryside, especially in the early spring when the air was crisp and fresh. One weekend, feeling the need to escape the city for a bit of solitude, I decided to rent a small cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't expecting luxury, just peace and quiet. No internet, no distractions, just me, a few books, and the serene landscape. The drive there wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first. I passed through small towns, each quieter than the last, the roads becoming more desolate the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin's area, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the narrow, winding road ahead. The cabin, according to the map, was another 5 miles down the road. I could see no signs of life, no other cars, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The phone signal had long since disappeared, and I had no way of contacting anyone, even if I wanted to. The last stretch of road was gravel, and it seemed as though I was driving deeper into the forest. There were no houses, no buildings, just thick woods on either side. It felt as if the world was closing in around me, but I wasn't scared. I'd been on plenty of lonely roads before, and I liked the sense of isolation. The silence was calming. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. This was exactly what I needed. I reached the cabin around dusk, its structure barely visible among the tall trees. It was an old, rustic building with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it had a charm to it that made me smile. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and went inside, immediately feeling the quiet warmth of the place. I locked the door behind me and opened the window to let in some fresh air. As I sat by the fire later that evening, reading and sipping tea, I noticed how still everything was. Not even the wind was stirring outside. The silence was absolute, but it didn't bother me. It was peaceful. Still, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that had been nagging at the back of my mind ever since I arrived. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lamp by the fire, closed the curtains, and climbed into bed. The sheets were rough, but they smelled faintly of lavender, which I liked. I tried to relax, but I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind that rattled the windows felt amplified in the stillness of the night. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard a noise. At first, it sounded like someone moving around outside. I listened intently, straining to hear through the thick walls of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too measured. Footsteps. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I waited, hoping it was just an animal or my imagination. But the footsteps continued, soft but distinct. They seemed to be circling the cabin. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I had seen no one when I arrived. No other cars, no other signs of life. I had even checked the windows before closing the curtains. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was as if someone or something was right outside my door. The sound of movement came to a halt. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. Soft at first, then louder, as if someone was gently tapping at the door. I didn't know what to do. My mind was telling me to get up to check, but my body refused to obey. My fear paralyzed me, and I just lay there staring at the door, waiting. Nothing happened for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, at the silence around me now unbearable. I finally gathered enough courage to rise from the bed. I crept toward the window, the curtains still drawn, but I couldn't help myself. I peeked through a small crack, praying that I wouldn't see anything. The porch was empty. No one was there. But that's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, just in front of the door. Fresh, clear prints leading up to the porch. I hadn't seen those when I arrived. My legs felt weak and I sank back onto the bed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been here earlier, maybe I had missed it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I would have seen anyone who passed through. I had checked the area carefully. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every crack and groan of the house, jumping at every gust of wind. The footsteps never returned, but the unease never left. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just the result of an overactive imagination. Maybe the house had settled, or maybe it was just an animal. I didn't want to believe in the supernatural, didn't want to acknowledge that something might be wrong with the place. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something was waiting just outside the door. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. I needed to get out of the cabin, get some air. The woods were dense, and as I walked further, I noticed that the trees seemed to close in on me. The path was barely visible, overgrown with weeds, but I pressed on, hoping that the fresh air would calm my nerves. As I wandered, I noticed a small clearing in the woods, the sun filtering through the branches overhead. It seemed peaceful, but as I stepped into the center, I froze. In the dirt, there were more footprints. Not just one set, but several, and they were scattered around the clearing as if someone had been pacing. They were fresh, just like the ones outside the cabin, but they weren't animal tracks. They were too deliberate, too human. My heart sank. I turned quickly and made my way back to the cabin. I didn't look back. That afternoon, I packed my things and left. I didn't want to stay another night, not with the footsteps and the strange feeling that something wasn't right. I drove away, never looking in the rearview mirror, never turning back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to see. As I drove back toward civilization, I tried to convince myself it was just a bad experience, an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and darkness. But deep down, I knew something had been there, something I couldn't explain. I haven't gone back to that part of the country since. The memory still haunts me, and every time I drive through desolate roads now, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing just beyond the tree line. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. Sure, I had heard the stories, the ones people tell around campfires or in hushed voices over drinks, but those stories were just that, stories. Until one night, I found myself deep in the middle of nowhere, and I learned firsthand that some things can't be explained away. It started with a weekend trip I had planned to escape the chaos of city life. I wanted peace, solitude, just me, the road, and the wide open country. I rented a small cabin nestled on a plot of land so remote that the nearest town was a 45-minute drive away. I'd seen photos online, and it looked perfect, rustic, surrounded by trees, and far enough from civilization that I would have nothing but the sound of wind and birds for company. The drive out was long and tiring, with the highway slowly turning into winding country roads, then dirt tracks. The GPS on my phone lost signal about 30 minutes from the cabin. I had to rely on the handwritten instructions the owner had left me. The final stretch of the journey was nothing but dense trees on either side, so thick that the sunlight barely made it through the canopy. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake, but the excitement of the peaceful retreat kept me going. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was setting. It was a beautiful, remote place, exactly what I had imagined. There was a small porch, a stack of firewood next to the door, and a few chairs that faced the open wilderness. I unloaded my bags, brought in the groceries, and got settled. That evening, I lit a fire in the fireplace and made dinner. The warmth from the flames and the smell of cooking food helped me shake off the eerie feeling that had settled on me during the drive. The cabin was cozy, the kind of place where you could relax without any distractions. The sun went down quickly, and soon it was just me, the fire, and the quiet. I sat in my chair reading a book when I heard something. It was a soft, almost imperceptible knock on the front door. I froze. I couldn't imagine anyone being out there. There was no one for miles, as far as I knew. I got up, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness around the cabin, but there was nothing, just the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe the wind had caused the sound. But then it happened again, about an hour later. A knock. 3 knocks. This time, I didn't get up immediately. My heart was racing, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought about the possibility that someone was out there, but it didn't make sense. Who would come all the way out here, to a cabin so far from any main road? I told myself it was just a tree branch tapping against the door. But when I opened it again, I saw nothing. The porch was silent. I locked the door behind me and tried to push the unease from my mind, but it lingered. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't want to go outside again. That night, I finally managed to fall asleep in the quiet darkness, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the house, coming closer and closer. I sat up in bed, frozen, my heart hammered in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, someone walking around the cabin right outside my window. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and moved cautiously to the window. I shone the light outside, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. Still, the footsteps continued. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, the sound heavy on the wooden porch. I felt the hair on my neck stand up, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I turned off the flashlight and moved away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone had no service, and I wasn't about to go outside to check the landline. The fear that gripped me was suffocating. I lay in bed for hours, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds outside. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In the dead of night, the cabin was unnervingly still, like something was waiting. The next morning, I was exhausted. The sun had barely risen when I made myself some coffee, trying to shake the unease from the night before. I convinced myself I had imagined everything. Maybe it was just a raccoon, a wild animal, or some other natural occurrence. But when I went outside to gather some firewood, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Large, heavy footprints that circled the cabin, disappearing into the trees. The prints were clear in the soft earth, as if someone had been walking around the cabin in the night, just as I had heard. I followed the trail for a few steps before I realized I was shaking, my mind spinning with panic. I didn't know how to explain it. I turned around and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. My thoughts raced. I had to leave. But the thought of driving down that lonely road again, at night, was terrifying. My mind was clouded with fear, but I knew I couldn't stay. The strange occurrences continued throughout the day, small, unsettling things. The sound of knocks on the door, whispers carried on the wind, and the unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. As the sun began to set again, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling. I couldn't wait another minute. I needed to get out of there to escape whatever was haunting the cabin. But as I reached the door, I hesitated. The knocks came once more, loud and insistent. 3 sharp raps. Then the footsteps started again, moving slowly, steadily, coming toward the door. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys, ran to the car, and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely start the engine. I pulled out of the driveway, my tires kicking up dust as I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I drove for what felt like hours, the weight of the eerie silence pressing on my chest. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I stopped at a gas station to gather myself before heading back to the city. That's when I saw the man. He was standing on the porch of the gas station, watching me. He had a weathered face, eyes that seemed to hold too many secrets. He waved, and I hesitated before walking toward him. "You were at the cabin, weren't you?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "I wouldn't go back if I were you," he said, his gaze steady. "People don't last long out there." Before I could say anything, he turned and walked back into the shadows. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't need to. I never returned to that cabin. I never went back to that stretch of road. But every now and then, when the wind is right and the night is still, I hear those footsteps again. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The drive out to the cabin seemed like a good idea at the time. A weekend away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just me, the road, and the peace of being in the middle of nowhere. I needed it. Work had been exhausting, and I was looking forward to solitude. The directions were simple enough, but as I turned off the main highway, the road quickly became unfamiliar. It was an old country road, lined with overgrown trees that almost seemed to swallow the sunlight. The houses grew sparse as I moved further down the winding path, the occasional farmhouse appearing for a few seconds before disappearing behind thick forests. I wasn't worried. The cabin wasn't far now, according to the map on my phone, and I knew it was the perfect spot to recharge. The GPS had been spotty for the last half hour, but I didn't think much of it. As the road narrowed and the trees closed in, a strange feeling settled over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavy, like the world had become a little too still. I could hear the faint hum of insects outside my window, but the silence inside the car was unsettling. I glanced at the clock. It was almost sunset. There was no rush, but I was eager to get to the cabin before nightfall. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road where the map directed me to take a left. I slowed down, peering through the windshield, trying to make out the road in the dimming light. The road was dirt now, and the further I drove, the less likely it seemed that anyone else had been down this way for a long time. My phone had lost service, and the signs of civilization seemed to vanish with every turn. I started to feel uneasy, but brushed it off. It was just me, the road, and the trees. No reason to be afraid. But then, I saw it. The cabin. Or at least, I thought it was the cabin. It stood on a small hill, shrouded in fog that had rolled in faster than I expected. The old, weathered wood of the structure looked almost abandoned, but it was unmistakably the place I had rented. A chill ran down my spine, though I told myself it was just the cold night air. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, feeling a slight reluctance in my steps. Something wasn't quite right, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. The place was isolated, no neighbors nearby, which added to the appeal, but also made it all the more eerie. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The cabin had that old, musty smell. The kind of place where the air felt thick, as though it had been closed up for years. I turned on the lights and started a fire in the hearth, hoping the warmth would chase away the strange sensation that lingered. As the evening wore on, I made myself dinner and settled into an armchair by the fire with a book. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the feeling of being watched persisted. The wind outside howled, the trees shaking and groaning with every gust. But it wasn't just the storm that unsettled me. There was something else. Around midnight, I went to bed. The sheets were scratchy, but I didn't mind. I tried to sleep, but the more I thought about it, the harder it was to ignore the strange sensations. The sound of footsteps, muffled but deliberate, seemed to echo through the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening. The house was old, so creaks and groans were normal, but this was different. It wasn't the house settling. It sounded like someone was walking out slowly, methodically. I held my breath, listening intently. There was no breeze, no reason for the noise, yet it continued. Step, 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 then silence. I convinced myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or perhaps an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp earth. The fog hadn't lifted. I got out of bed and peered through the window. The trees were still shrouded in mist, and the whole area felt off. But again, I tried to ignore it. I had the whole day to enjoy the solitude, and I wasn't about to let some strange noises ruin my trip. I spent the day hiking through the forest around the cabin. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into the woods, like the forest itself was leading me somewhere. But I didn't turn back. The path was quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps breaking the silence. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something unexpected. It was a small clearing in the woods with an old, weathered bench. But that wasn't what made me stop. It was the fresh footprints in the dirt. They were large, unmistakably human. I looked around, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I had seen no one all day. No one had passed by. No cars had come down the road. The only movement I had seen was the wind stirring the trees. But these prints were recent. I quickly left the clearing and made my way back to the cabin, my pace quickening. When I got back, I bolted the door and checked every window, making sure they were locked. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though someone was out there, watching. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though my anxiety only grew. When night fell, I could hear more footsteps, faint but distinct. I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself that it was probably just an animal, or maybe a neighbor walking through the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Around 3 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of knocking on the cabin door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone the entire time I had been there. Who could be knocking at my door in the middle of the night? I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, hoping it was just the wind or my imagination. But the knocking continued, louder now, as though whoever was outside was determined to be heard. I couldn't stay in there any longer. I grabbed my keys, not bothering to grab anything else, and ran out the back door. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my heart racing. I threw the car into drive and sped off down the road, not once looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was knocking on that door. I don't know who left those footprints in the clearing, or who was walking around the cabin at night. But I know one thing for sure. I never went back to that cabin again. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
It started as a road trip, an adventure to break the monotony of life. Sarah and her boyfriend, Mike, were headed to a secluded cabin they'd rented for the weekend. The GPS had directed them off the main highway and onto a winding country road. At first, it was picturesque. Tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sunlight dappled the road. But as dusk fell, the charm faded. The dense forest seemed to close in around them, and the road stretched endlessly ahead, narrowing like a noose. "We're definitely in the middle of nowhere," Sarah muttered, her voice tinged with unease. Mike grinned, though his knuckles were tight on the steering wheel. "That's the point. Disconnect, unwind, no distractions." Sarah tried to relax, but the darkening surroundings gnawed at her nerves. The signal bars on her phone vanished. A sense of isolation crept in. A sign appeared up ahead, weathered and barely legible. Miller's Hollow, 5 miles. The cabin was supposed to be nearby, but this wasn't a town she remembered reading about. As they continued, the car's headlights cut through an unnatural mist that seemed to rise out of nowhere, cloaking the trees and road in a heavy, suffocating fog. The cabin was nowhere in sight. "Let's just turn around," Sarah suggested, but as Mike reached for the brakes, the car sputtered, jolted, and died. The headlights dimmed, leaving them in near total darkness. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start. Sarah grabbed her phone, the screen lighting her worried face. "Still no signal," she said. Mike sighed and leaned back in his seat. "We'll wait for it to cool off. Maybe it's just overheated." The forest around them was eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, deafening silence. Sarah glanced out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. That's when she saw it, a faint figure standing in the mist just off the road. "Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Mike turned his head, squinting into the fog. "Where?" "There," she pointed, her finger shaking. The figure was barely discernible now, but its shape was unmistakable. It was tall, unnaturally still, and facing their car. "Probably a farmer or someone local," Mike said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "I'll see if they can help." "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm, her pulse racing. "Don't go out there." But Mike was already opening the door. The damp, cold air rushed in as he stepped outside. "Hey!" he called into the fog. The figure didn't move. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Mike, get back in the car," she pleaded, her voice rising. Mike took a few steps forward. "Hello? Do you need help?" The figure began to move, slowly at first, then with an unnatural, jerky gait. It didn't seem to be walking so much as gliding toward them. Mike froze. "Okay, that's creepy," he muttered, backing up toward the car. "Get in," Sarah screamed, fumbling with the locks. Mike yanked the door open and slid inside just as the figure reached the edge of the headlights. For a split second, the light illuminated its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over its skull. The thing raised a hand, skeletal and impossibly long, and pointed at the car. The car jolted violently as if something had slammed into it. Sarah screamed, clutching Mike's arm. The figure was gone. Mike twisted the key in desperation, and this time the engine roared to life. "Hold on," he shouted, slamming the car into reverse. Gravel sprayed as they sped backward, and he twisted the wheel to turn the car around. The mist thickened, and the road became a blur. "Are we even on the right road?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Does it matter?" Mike snapped, his voice edged with panic. Out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw movement. Shapes darting between the trees, barely visible but undeniably there. "They're following us," she whispered. Mike didn't respond. His focus was on the road, or what he thought was the road. The mist played tricks on their eyes, making every turn feel like a loop. Then, suddenly, the car jerked to a stop. "What now?" Mike growled, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. The headlights revealed a massive tree that hadn't been there moments before, its gnarled branches twisting like claws. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice cracking. Mike grabbed a flashlight from the glove box. "We'll have to walk." "No, Mike. Please, let's just wait." "Wait for what?" he snapped. "For those things to come back? We can't just sit here." Reluctantly, Sarah got out, clutching her jacket tightly around her. The air was colder now, biting and unnatural. They started down the road, the flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The silence pressed in on them, each step echoing like a gunshot. Then they heard it, a whisper, soft at first but growing louder, coming from all directions. Words they couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Mike nodded, his face pale. "Keep moving." But the whispers grew louder, and the fog thickened until they could barely see each other. Panic set in as Sarah reached for Mike's hand, only to find it wasn't there. "Mike?" she called, her voice rising in fear. No response. "Mike!" she screamed, spinning in circles. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. And then she saw them. Figures surrounding her, their faceless heads tilted as if studying her. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. The cold seeped into her bones, and the whispers became deafening, filling her head with nonsensical words that made her want to claw at her ears. "Please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone." The figures stood motionless, but the air around her grew heavier. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Just as she thought she would lose consciousness, a hand grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. It was Mike. "Run!" he shouted, pulling her forward. They didn't stop until they stumbled onto a clearing where the fog seemed to dissipate. In the distance, they saw headlights, another car on the road. They waved frantically and the car stopped. An older man rolled down his window. "You folks okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. "We need help," Mike panted. "Our car broke down and—" "You shouldn't be out here," the man interrupted, his face grave. "Not at night." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. The man hesitated, then said, "This road, it's cursed. Folks around here call it the Hollow Road. People disappear out here. Best you let me take you to town." They didn't argue. As the man drove them away, Sarah glanced out the window. The mist was gone, and the road looked normal again. But just before they turned a corner, she saw a figure standing in the distance, watching them. Faceless. Story the end.